Greetings and welcome to Vantage Point. We have an interesting program, I think, today. I'm your host, Marcia Boyles, and let me begin by introducing our guest. This is resident Paul Gonson. And Paul, we're just delighted to have you today, and we'll be asking you in a minute or two what you can tell us about the topic of legacy. This is our second show on legacy. The first show that we had centered mostly on ethical wills, and today we're going to be doing something slightly different. So let me, as always, turn this over to my esteemed partner, Kathleen Taylor.
Yeah, well, welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Yeah, I mean, I think that, what Marcia and I are finding is that the whole topic of legacy is just such an interesting and deep topic, and probably speaks directly to some of our most basic human needs to be able to sort of have made a mark on life, to have a sense of purpose and meaning. When I was, remind me, what was your definition of legacy?
Oh yes, you and I Googled and looked in the dictionary and went back and forth on this, and I came up with the definition of it's stuff you leave. Stuff you leave. That's and I think you had a slightly more elegant definition than that. Yeah,
but kind of the same. It's a quote by Erik Erikson, who's, as you know, one of my favorite people. He's a developmental psychiatrist. But his statement was, I am what survives me. And that's kind of stuff you leave too. And what we know in sort of thinking about legacy is that there are tangible goods that people want to leave, concrete things like money, of course, and different kinds of things, furniture. My mom gave me furniture, so I know that. But what we're really looking at is more about the intangible things that people leave behind in terms of statements of their values, but also I think you're going to get into the personal narratives that people create. That are our stories, our life stories, and how those stories connect together to make a picture of who we are and where we've been and what the meaning of our lives were and what the purpose of our life was. And that's what I think is exciting about the idea of legacy.
Actually, you're leading right into the conversation that Paul and I had that really led to your agreeing to come on to the show, Paul. I said to Paul, we did a program on ethical wills, and indeed you saw it, Paul.
Very good.
And I said that I was aware of the fact that ethical wills had a 2,000 or 3,000 year history that dated back to Jewish groups. And so I asked you, being a Jewish person, whether or not you had any tradition of ethical wills in your family. And you said no. And you can take it from there if you would.
Yes, ethical wills are certainly mentioned in the Old Testament, as you mentioned last time, or I guess in your program mentioned. And there, in the Old Testament, it really refers to written documents that are given by a father to his son, or a deathbed declaration.
Paul, let me stop you right there, and I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't really say anything about your background and credentials, and I think they do fit into this, so I'm going out of order here a little bit, so excuse my interruption. Paul has been a practicing attorney. You were a law professor and certainly very high up in government circles as an attorney. So with that, Paul, excuse me for being out of order.
That's all right. Glad to have that endorsement. But unlike the written documents that are referred to in the Old Testament, I would like to talk about the transmission of legacies or values that are done orally or by example from parents. And there's no formal writing or no deathbed declaration. There never was given to me any sermon or lecture about it. It was something that sort of naturally happened day by day and living with my parents. Now these were old country traditions. A lot of them are Jewish oriented, although I don't mean to imply that other races or religions also wouldn't have some of these in common. They certainly do. One example I want to give is when I graduated from high school, my father said to me, "Paul, you can be anything you want so long as it's a lawyer or a doctor." And I became a lawyer, my brother became a lawyer, and in our family, extended family, I count 12 lawyers and 4 doctors. And you've probably heard this saying, this variation of what was a joke in our household: what's the definition of a lawyer? And the answer was, a nice Jewish boy who's afraid of blood. But they all weren't all boys. Of the 12, 4 of them were women. And my father, who was a successful businessman, didn't want either of his sons to succeed him in business. Rather, he wanted us to be professionals. And the reason that he gave for it was really very interesting. He grew up in what is today Ukraine, but then was part of Russia, and experienced pogroms against Jewish people. And personally and his family were forced to flee during the Russian Revolution in 1918 from their home on one day's notice with only what they could carry. And my father said that they can take away your land and they can take away your possessions, but they can't take away what's in your head. Another example I'd like to give was that every Jewish child should take up a musical instrument. My mother was a very cultured woman. She sang opera and sang Jewish folk songs and folk melodies from Eastern Europe. Was very much in demand and popular in Buffalo, New York, where we grew up, to sing on programs, and she played the mandolin. My father was hardly musical. He was very well schooled in what Jewish boys were, Jewish men, in Hebrew and in Jewish and literature, Bible, Talmud, and background. But he said the only thing he could play was the radio. But he and my mother insisted that we take lessons, so I took the piano and my brother took the violin. I have 2 sons. One son plays the cello, and he has 2 children, and his son, my grandson, also plays the cello. And my granddaughter played the oboe for a while, found that she didn't like it, and now plays the clarinet. My other son plays the violin. He got very good at it. And both sons played the cello and violin for about 10 years, played in their school orchestras. And my violin playing son, his son, my grandson, who's 17 years old, he also plays the violin, plays in the school orchestra. And I get a thrill when I hear my son and my grandson play classical music duets on their violins.
Is this common in Jewish families? I mean, my sense of it is that it really is in terms of musical instruments.
It is very so. It was a tradition or a legacy, if you want to put it, that would go down from the family, as I've indicated, into 3 generations. Now, as strong as my parents were insisting that I and my brother and my kids play musical instruments, at the same time, they did not want us to be so, my father would say, don't fall in love with your musical instrument. They did not want us to become professional musicians. And the reason for that was, my father would point out that some professional musicians make it to the top, they do very well, but most of them really don't make a very good living. And he wanted us to make a good living, beside being professional people. And his role model was Abe Fortas, who played the violin on Sunday nights with friends. They had a quartet, a foursome, But his day job was as a lawyer, and indeed a lawyer to President Lyndon Johnson, and then as a Supreme Court justice. So that's the kind of musician that he wanted us to be.
And lawyer that he wanted you to be.
And lawyer that he wanted us to be.
Yes.
He was a successful businessman, but he didn't want his boys to be following in his footsteps, even though, as I said, the business was successful. Rather, he wanted us to be professionals. Another example was being charitable. This is a very, very strong virtue in culture in Judaism. Being charitable. My father would be very charitable. He gave a lot of money to Jewish charities, but he also gave to St. Vincent de Paul, which of course was a Catholic church. St. Vincent de Paul was in the neighborhood where my father had his modest factory where he made mattresses in Box Springs and had a big furniture store. And he observed how St. Vincent de Paul was very, very good helping poor people. My father also felt that charity was something that you gave to poor people. His saying was that a rabbit's skin is not worth very much except to the rabbit. And by that he meant that poor people have few possessions, but the possessions that they do have were very important to them. Another feature was patriotism, and that, of course, isn't exclusive to Judaism. Many people are patriotic, but it was patriotism in the way that that people who come from other countries here, immigrants, are patriotic. They appreciate the free country that we have and the opportunities that they have. My father came here without any money and not speaking English, and he worked himself up to be a very successful businessman. So he came to very much love this country for the opportunities that it gave to people and the freedom that we have. Now, we never displayed a flag on holidays. We didn't even own a flag. So the patriotism was a different kind of patriotism that you often see elsewhere. Now, I can still hear in my mind this recital that he would give when he had problems. He had a crisis in business or he had difficulty with his family. He would recite out loud, "I live in a free country. I have married to a wonderful woman. I have 2 great sons. I live in a good house in a nice neighborhood, and I make a good living." And what he was doing was he was saying in his way that this crisis that I have in business or this problem, when viewed in this larger context, really isn't so bad after all. Right. So this wasn't something that say he would give at the Thanksgiving table. It was something that he would recite as problems would arise. But his first message was, "I live in a free country." That was his most important part.
Wow. Counting his blessings.
He was, that's a good way to put it, good way to put it. He was counting his blessings in this way. Now, I talked about some of the traditions or legacies that go from the top down, from the parents down. I would like to talk about another one that goes from the bottom up. I would like to start with my 17-year-old grandson, who I refer to as the violinist who plays in the school orchestra. He is, and was for many years, a basketball player and an all-around very good athlete. And I wanted to read just a portion of an email that his basketball coach sent to his mother, to my daughter-in-law. He said, "I just want to compliment Sam," and his name is Sam. He's named after my father, Sam Gonson, the current Sam Gonson. "I want to compliment Sam on a game well played Sunday." And then he goes on to talk about how Sam played well. And then he adds, "But what really impresses me about Sam is how he treats everyone as an equal and really supports his teammates efforts regardless of their ability. It is one thing to be good, it is better to be good with all the right qualities. And this really describes Sam. I've never heard Sam speak ill of anybody. He's always courteous and friendly to everybody. And he is just a wonderful, wonderful child.
And you see this really as a carrying on of the same tradition that your parents did, your generation did.
That's exactly right.
Your son and now your grandson.
Right. So my grandson has the qualities of his father, of my son, who is very much like that. And I like to think that I have those qualities. My wife Joan says that I'm non-judgmental, which I guess is another way of saying that.
That's a good thing.
And also my father, who was a very astute businessman, was a gentleman. He was courteous to everybody, treated everybody equally. In his mattress factory, he worked together with his employees. They spoke to each other in their first names. They stayed a long time with him in his modest mattress factory. And then in the afternoons, my father and his workers would all go out together to the diner, which was about a block away, and they would have what my father called coffee and. And my mother used to tell my father, you better quit the and because you're putting on weight. and he was a person who treated everybody equally as well. And I have only a little bit of narrative about his father, who was my grandfather. My father said that they lived in a very, very big house. My grandfather was
this was in the Ukraine.
This was in the Ukraine, then called, today it's called Ukraine, then it was simply a part of Russia. And my mother had a grandmother had a very, very large house. They had many children. My father had many brothers and sisters. And they also had quite a few live-in servants. My father told me that he always thought that the maid was his sister. And it wasn't until he really became an older teenager that he realized she wasn't his sister. So
because of the way she was treated.
The way she was treated, and I guess as a sort of a proxy for the way that the other servants were treated, that is equally. So we talk really about 5 generations going down. There's my grandfather, grandmother, there's my father, there's me, there's my son, and then there's my grandson. So I think that's sort of a good example of how it goes down in generations.
Of seeing these same traits in all 5 generations.
That's right.
Well, what I'm definitely becoming aware of is you are such a marvelous storyteller.
Yes.
And I think that was something that was probably handed down to you, and just the idea that oral tradition of telling these stories which reflect the values and what's important to your family over the generations.
That's true.
That's what's been passed down. So though nobody wrote it down, those stories have become a living tradition that has gone.
And they're very strong.
Yeah,
they're
very
as
strong.
as a will is strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
I think more. I mean, in a way, more so because they have life every day.
True. Do I have another minute or two to talk about?
I think maybe we'll stop, Paul, and come back to you. Kathleen, you and I were talking yesterday about the idea that oral tradition clearly is what has gone on for
Ever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so Paul's recital here is certainly in the main tradition. I mean, the main tradition has not been writing things down. Certainly there was some of that, but think about it, Paul, that all these thousands of years, it has to have been oral tradition.
I think that you're right. I think that it is. It certainly is in my family and in other families that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm. Well, think of the shortage of books over there, and in so many countries, no books.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think that creating that narrative is really what makes sense of our lives to a certain extent, gives it a context and helps us find meaning. And I was just thinking about that driving in today. It's like the first thing that one of your children does, they come back from school and they tell you a story. This is what happened to me today, you know, and it's sort of like, you know, I think that that's the process that they use to sort of integrate their experience into more of a whole. And I think I mean, I do believe that is a human need to try to integrate those experiences into something that makes sense. And so that's what I love about storytelling and oral histories.
One of the things that I, as a biologist, of course, think about in terms of legacy and heritage is DNA. That when the diaspora out of Africa began tens of thousands of years ago, that the same DNA was passed on from one millennium to another. And that many of the traits and characteristics that were really hardwired in our ancestors are still present today. And I think we manifest many of those. Every time in the fall when I start to gain weight, when I'm putting on the pounds, I am sort of tipping my hat to my hunter-gatherer predecessors. Because clearly nuts and berries are really tough to find in the middle of the winter. So they
in case you have a poor harvest, you'll be ready.
Exactly. Or if the deer that I hunt are too lean to really eat. So yeah, I think we do have a legacy that we're totally unaware of most of the time. I also had a kind of interesting experience. In the last 6 weeks, I've had 2 relatives come stay with me. One of whom I had not seen for 55 years, and the other that I hadn't really had very minimal contact for 40 years. So these represented both sides of my family, either side of the family. And the one side of my family is very cerebral, very Scots English, very reserved, all very educated folk, lots of school teachers. The other side had deep roots in the Midwest, particularly Michigan, and up into northern Canada. They were 17th century, 18th century explorers, fur traders, that kind of thing. The ones, they are not at all like the Scots and the English. They are very creative, personable, always thinking outside the box. And I think what struck me, which seems odd to have come to this realization as an older person, that I personally am a mixture of those two many traits. And I think I hadn't really thought about this. Our families have, like many families here, I think have just, everybody has scattered to the ends of the earth, and we had not been in contact. So it really was a realization that heritage traits of families, cultures of families, characteristics. Certainly we see it in ourselves, we see it in our kids, our grandkids.
Yeah, and I love that story because it's really, we see ourselves, when we reflect back on our history and discover the stories about our forebears, and then we see ourselves in our children too. So, yes. we see ourselves along that historical line when we do that. I think some of that, the newfound interest in genealogy and people going online and doing all those searches.
Ancestry.com.
Yeah, all of that going on. I think that's another attempt to kind of, find out where you fit and discover more about yourself. Your history, definitely, what are the characteristics of, the generations that were before you, and, what does that say about who you are now? That's fascinating.
Kathleen, you read a quote from Weil, did you not, about ethical wills, talking about the significance to the person doing the writing of it. Do you remember that?
Well, I don't remember it, but I did bring it because it's a little bit long.
Terrific.
Yeah. So what Andrew Weil, who's a holistic physician that we know pretty well, promotes preparing an ethical will as a gift of spiritual health. Asserts that the ethical will's main importance is what it gives the writer in the midst of life. And I think that's the process of writing the will. The goal of writing an ethical will is to link a person to both their family and cultural history, which we were talking about, clarify their ethical and spiritual values, and communicate a legacy to future generations. It addresses people's universal needs, like the need to connect and to find purpose and meaning. Writing an ethical will clarifies identity and focuses life purpose. Writing an ethical will addresses people's needs to belong, to be known, to be remembered, to have one's life make a difference, to bless and be blessed. I love that so much.
Yes, that's
I know.
very
it's
moving.
really nice. Yeah.
And really what we're talking about here is not just ethical wills and going through that process, but also, I think, Paul, in your remembering stories, your telling stories, my realization recently with family, and also going on Ancestry.com or the genealogy. So the process is all the same no matter how you approach it.
I think it's just trying to create that personal narrative, whatever that is, that gives your life a sense of meaning and purpose, because that's really what we're all about. And especially, I think, as we get older, you know, there's more of a desire to be able to do that, to reflect back and go, yeah, the life that I led was a good one, and this is what I did.
A summing up and almost a scorecard kind of thing. Do you get that sense sometimes? That we particularly go through this process as we're aging?
Yeah, yeah. I hope not as a scorecard. I hope as more of a process of self-acceptance and affirmation.
Well, the scorecard could be loaded in your favor.
Well, but I don't want people to, think it's like about, these are all the bad things I did in life. And I don't think people do that as a rule anyhow, because it really is about.
I think sort of in a grid, and I'm checks and
yes,
balances.
I don't think that way at all.
No, you don't think. No, I mean that's as a scientist, that's of course the way I think.
You, yeah.
So no, I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Scorecard is much too numerical.
Yeah. But I think, again, just to sort of wrap up, it really does speak to all the different ways that people go about, that process of trying to connect the dots and see, reflect back on where they've been and look forward to, where they're going or where their families are going, see themselves reflected in their world. And that's a really good process to go through.
Very healthy.
Mm-hmm. I believe that is very healthy.
Kathleen, I see that our time is coming to an end.
Yeah, so that means that we have to say goodbye.
Paul, it's been absolutely wonderful having you. You are a lovely storyteller, as Kathleen is pointing out.
Enjoyed it very much.
Great fun.
Thank you. Kathleen, I think you
I have
the announcements.
I have the honor of doing the announcements.
You do, and you do them so well.
I do. Thank you.